Why would you do this to me, Eric?
Listen, you if you're going to deal in the creatine, you got to deal with
Yeah.
the consequences.
All the way up. I mean, I am just a mid-tier player in this, a middleman, so to speak. I'm not a supplier. I'm also not a dealer. I'm just middle of the chain, passing the communication, passing some supplies along, and we're introduced now to Big Creatine. The person that probably is most responsible of Pablo Escobar, it was the cocaine kingpin. It's pretty safe to say that our next guest, Darren Candow, is the creatine kingpin of North America, at least.
Yeah, we got the Heisenberg of creatine on today.
Yeah,
Similar haircut too.
Yeah, by choice. I would say that with Darren, he's absolutely more fantastical in his appearance. I appreciated how he brought swag, and those on the video version, you'll see that had a lot of energy. One of those researchers that is able to effectively communicate on his topic with a lay audience. I think everyone's in for a treat. I think if you were on the fence when it comes to creatine, you thought to yourself, yeah, man, my muscles are already pretty swole. Yeah, man, I don't want to deal with quote unquote bloating, or I'm already the world's strongest person. In which case, hi Ed Cohen. You will be convinced to double dose on your creatine after this. That's all I'm going to say. Even if you're not interested in performance, when he started talking about the positive potential cognitive benefits, whew.
Yeah, I think that's probably the coolest part of this, is that I think most of us in the bodybuilding, powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman, physical culture community, we're all over creatine for the many reasons by which you make it your, I'll say your back alley secondary vocation, and that's strength, power, repeated anaerobic effort, ability, a little bit of size, a little bit of extra muscle growth. However, it's pretty interesting how many things creatine impacts. And looking at it as less of just an exogenous performance-enhancing powder that you should definitely buy from Omar, and more so as a compound in the body, and what it already produces, what areas it impacts, and all the different areas of potential study for how it could be a useful supplement. I think that's really where the gold in this episode is.
Absolutely. And I will say that the banter for the first 10 minutes, we get right into it. I think when we have a guest in person for one of us, we're just happy individuals that love to talk about things. So there's about 10 minutes of banter. I hope you guys enjoy it. There's a lot to uncover, as Eric indicated, when it relates to creatine. Even if you think you're a gym bro or broette, and you think to yourself, I know what creatine's about, just wait. I think you're going to learn something today.
Darren, how dare you? How dare you is what I just want to begin. We have someone who is essentially the mogul of an empire that was created and perpetuated now by the industry. It is the fitness industrial complex that you're one of the apex predators behind everything, honestly, the machinations that we see unfolding before us. Is there anything you want to say before we continue? Maybe a confession in terms of what you've done to the industry, the damage you've caused numerous impressionable youths such as myself that is now a lifelong addict. Is there anything that you want to say in a confession format that will, I don't know if it'll ever absolve you of your crimes, but just somehow in the public conscience, make them feel that you're not a complete monster?
There's many that I would have to go with, but the biggest one would be, I'm sorry for causing so much strain to the ergogenic aid society. And unfortunately, creatine is not a steroid, but it certainly has steroid-like effects to the body.
Wow.
And so today, hopefully, we're going to get into some information dispelling a lot of myths.
Yep.
And I would argue that creatine is actually more important than dietary protein.
Yeah.
People will hate it. They will throw things at your screen and all that, but we'll talk about that potentially.
Well, wow. I appreciate you're brave. Yeah, he's brave for being on, Eric, because you're wearing right now. I see the shirt you're wearing, almost like we're trying to self-identify that we don't take creatine, but...
Well, I've just had my reality rocked in about 3 different ways. One, we had an admission from who was the shadow puppet of the drug industry, basically say, hey, I am culpable. and I'm sorry for the strain, but you know what? I'm going to keep doing it. That's important. So he's basically saying, yeah, I am the Corleone behind doing the puppets, but the puppet show will go on. So that rocked my world. Second,
full Walter White mode, Eric. Full Walter White.
That's right. Yeah. Heisenberg is on the show, right?
Yeah.
And realizing that Walter White is actually the alter ego that was just there the whole time, the facade of the real person. Second, we found out that you are actually natural, which is shocking. Actually very encouraging, because I've always been unimpressed by your gains as an enhanced athlete. So you're doing great. You actually just leveled up.
Well, I've received numerous allegations throughout the years of just my sheer, either the strength, the size, Darren,
combination of the two.
I don't know if you could see the traps from the video. For those that are just listening at home, I'm busting out of a size small shirt, okay, at a 5'10". It's scary, and I always knew that I was natural despite taking copious quantities of that white powdered substance. But there are people online, let's just call them they said I couldn't do it. They said I stood no chance. They said that I was enhanced. We just heard from Big Creatine, aka Darren, that I'm natural. So I feel if we want to wrap this one up, this was actually just an admission, an explanation, and now we've reached the end.
Yeah, the title is Omar Isuf becomes natural on air, I think is the title of this one.
With white powder.
With white powder. And by the way, there was three shockers. Yep. And we're not going to not get away from the third shocker. And that is that the audacity of a creatine researcher sitting here next to a protein researcher, just to say, hey, creatine's more important than protein, and expect me not to throw him out the window. Yeah. And he's lucky I'm not. I just don't feel like I have the ATP generation ability to do it now. But
he has too much protein.
Yeah, exactly. I'm weighed down by my protein and don't have enough creatine. So
the funny thing is, the talk I give tomorrow is on protein.
Wow. I want to change mine to being on creatine.
They're my two best friends, protein and creatine.
But apparently one's better than the other.
Without question.
Wow.
Without question. And we'll talk about why the hype of protein is actually changing quite a bit. It's funny, when you look at the comparison, are you more impressed with muscle mass, body fat loss, strength, power, endurance? If you were to rate them, and I can't wait to go against Stu Phillips or someone like that in a debate, because when you look at every category, creatine wins, except for protein synthesis. But the theory is that we can see people not eating enough protein, creatine still increases lean tissue mass. So the magical power, and when you add creatine to protein, you get greater gains. When you do the meta-analysis, if you extrapolate it, the people who take creatine seem to do a bit better. So you got to have a positive nitrogen balance for protein, obviously. You guys will be taking maybe 1 gram per pound, especially here in Canada. We're going to use the basic matrix. Everybody's getting enough protein. I highly doubt they're getting enough creatine from their diet. Even if you're a pescatarian, you're probably not going to get enough from seafood, for sure.
So, Darren, real quick, what is creatine? What's it made of?
Yeah, it's a nitrogen-containing compound, arginine, glycine, methionine. So a combination of an essential amino acid, non-essential. So it's a protein-like compound.
Right. Protein-like. I would actually say it's pretty much protein.
So then my question is, why not just take branched-chain amino acids?
Well, because they don't contain all the essential amino acids, which protein does, which also includes BCAA. So what I'm saying is that the apex predator, the king of the monsters, if you watch the most successful Godzilla film recently to come out,
protein.
Not true.
It was
protein.
Godzilla, not King of the Monsters, but yeah, go on.
Well, it's Godzilla, King of Monsters.
Yeah. Was the second most successful of the two released recently, so it actually was in last place, my friend.
But I'm saying it's the most successful of all time, but I was being facetious. It was just a pop cultural reference that you're wasting time on now.
We're going all the way in on that one.
All right. Well, you know what? You're like Ghidorah. You're the alien who's not part of this conversation, flying in, who's going to eventually die. So no big deal. But the point is, protein's at the top. Everything else comes underneath it. So we can say that protein isn't the king, but we know that everything is comes from that seed. It's the genesis factor, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and there's no doubt you got to be in a positive nitrogen balance with protein.
I'll take that as a concession of the win. So
yeah. We'll give them that for now, but we'll come back to the overall. But I think it comes down, I think the protein, zealots, for example, and I take at least a gram per pound, so about 200 grams a day, my guess is it's primarily just for muscle mass or maintenance. But creatine has such a multifactorial benefit to the body: cognitive, brain health, bone density, Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's disease, neuro. If you had to pick one best overall, there's no question. It trumps caffeine from an overall performance standpoint. Creatine would be far superior, and it's all backed on research. You'd be hard-pressed. The IOC suggested protein at best is for recovery. But if you're looking for muscle mass, strength, performance, agility, there's not anything out there. Even anabolic steroids wouldn't have the multifactorial effects of creatine, primarily monohydrate.
Are you saying that anabolic steroids aren't here for neuroprotective health? Is that what you're saying?
I'm pretty much saying I won't even talk about the anabolic effects.
All right. So I think we need to back the truck up. This is Darren Candow, folks. Dr. Darren Candow. Welcome to Iron Culture.
Thank you.
So I am here in the beautiful city of Regina, that as they say rhymes with fun. And we're here just a couple days prior to the auspicious annual conference that you guys put on, and I'm fortunate and lucky to be getting to present at it. And for those who don't know, well, let me put it this way: if you've taken I would even say an undergraduate level research-based course, and you've had to cite something in the realm of sports nutrition, or especially if you've done your master's degree or your PhD in the realm of exercise physiology, you've probably cited Candow, and that is one and the same. This man right here. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's awesome to be here.
It's a pleasure.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, the spoilers came out front, and that's okay, because I kind of like to eat my dessert before dinner.
And I'm biased.
It's like watching a trailer, the trailer of the movie you're about to see right before you watch the movie. You're getting hyped. You're anticipating. You know, Darren, you've been on, you said, podcast before. You know how to make the individual, the listener, salivate in anticipation of what's to come. So I think everyone's intrigued thus far.
Okay, good. And hopefully debate, right? You don't want everybody agreeing with you, because that's the whole point.
Absolutely. Yeah. We started with the debate that was already concluded that everything comes from protein. That's the most important.
That's exactly right.
So, I mean, we started with you losing a debate, which is a great entrance into the podcast.
I could just eat carrots all day and get that 1 gram.
As long as you get enough carrots to get to enough amino acids.
I'll talk about that tomorrow, actually. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What we need is just carrots infused with creatine, and then we're pretty much set. Yeah. And little known fact, if you eat enough carrots and you get enough beta carotene, you won't even need protein on stage because you'll be so orange.
That's right.
So multiple benefits.
I fear for the person who's listening to this podcast. It's like, look, man, I just want to learn a little bit about creatine and what's up. And the level of sarcasm is so thick, the intellectual posturing between you two, where they're like, okay, I don't know what's reality and what's, fiction right now. I just need to know. So let me be the voice of reason. We're talking very much so about politics before this began. So let me be the voice of reason in quotations.
The moderator.
Yeah, the moderator. Well, let's back up for a second. Darren, we need a definition of what this mythical, magical substance, creatine, what is it? What does it do?
So creatine is basically the foundation of high-energy phosphate metabolism. So any anaerobic sport, bodybuilding, resistance training, Usain Bolt, Olympic sprinting, anybody use the anaerobic energy system, which is ideally about 10 to 15 seconds of maximal effort, you're primarily using phosphocreatine. So it's the main sidekick to ATP. So if you think of Batman and Robin, phosphocreatine is going to be Robin. ATP will be Batman. So you need to maintain your ATP levels. And repeatedly, over time, you can do more muscle contraction. So the theory was that at the Olympic Games in 1996, a lot of Olympic athletes, primarily in track and field, were supplementing with this white powder called creatine monohydrate. It seemed to allow them to run faster, increase muscle recovery. So over time, when you're training, you can get in the gym more frequent, have less fatigue or soreness, and therefore all the parameters were going up: muscle strength, power, and endurance. So all creatine basically does, it rephosphorylates adenosine diphosphate. So every time, picture if you're doing 10 bicep contractions, every time you contract, you break down ATP to release a phosphate bond for energy. And so if you don't replenish that, you get fatigued. So the theory is that if you have more creatine in the muscle, and when you digest it through a supplementation, or it has the highest concentration in fatty fish, the more you consume, the more it's in your muscle, and you can exercise at a higher capacity. So, of course, it got a lot of premise in 1992 when probably one of the world's best researchers, Roger Harris, looked at a study where they took individuals like ourselves and they said, here, let's give you 20 grams a day of creatine, which is equivalent to about 5 salmon steaks. Take it for 5 straight days. It maximized the amount that's in your muscle. And then, of course, subsequent studies, and there's been about 1,000 actually published, have shown consistently that creatine increases everything from muscle mass, strength, endurance. We just published a meta-analysis that showed it actually stimulates fat loss. It was the first time we thought that we didn't. Most people say I gained water retention, and if you want to talk about that, that drives me bananas when people say it just leads to water retention. So creatine is something that we consume either in the diet. We naturally produce it from 3 amino acids: arginine, glycine, methionine. So even vegetarians are producing a small amount, but of course they don't have very much in the muscle, where someone who eats a lot of red meat or seafood on a run of a day would have a lot. So that gets into the responders versus non-responders, or factors that influence it. So basically, in summary, you take in dietary creatine or synthesize it, you can exercise at a higher capacity. So bodybuilding, Olympic athletes, high-performance athletes, in theory, I'd be shocked if someone who's trying to progress is not taking creatine or dietary creatine.
Fantastic. And let me then add to the next question. If we can attempt to try and quantify the effects or the magnitude of effects for an individual that is looking to supplement with creatine, now that you said, you know what, that there is some efficacy, what are we looking at then for an individual? So you start taking, let's assume, and we'll get into the different types of creatine, monohydrate, and so forth, but let's assume that you're taking the appropriate dose. Can we somehow quantify what someone expects to gain, or is there a range? How does it work?
Yeah, and you can divide into 2 groups: young individuals, which I consider under the age of 50, and then aging individuals over 50. So in theory, all the meta-analysis and the work suggests that if you're looking to put on lean tissue mass, which is muscle, you can expect anywhere between 1 to 3 kilograms. But here's the caveat. Creatine will only work when it's combined with resistance training. You can take creatine until you're blue in the face, and if you sit on the couch, it does nothing per se. So you need the stimulus of resistance training to combine or activate the magic of creatine. So let's be clear, for those watching, if you just take creatine supplement and you don't work out, expect nothing. But if you work out and take creatine, you should expect about a 1 to 3 kilogram increase in lean tissue mass, and that's assessed by DEXA, bioelectrical impedance, or air displacement plasmography. So that's really important for people trying to increase muscle mass. And then the theory is that if you have 100% of your body, bone, organ, blood usually doesn't change too much. If you increase the percent of lean tissue mass, inevitably percent body fat is going to come down. So the theory also with creatine is it increases energy expenditure. It sort of stimulates metabolism. So for even people that are bodybuilding going on stage, creatine could be very effective. In addition to lean tissue mass, which has implications for frailty, aging, the big push right now is on muscle performance. We see percent increases in strength by 12% over just resistance training. So let me be clear. If you just resistance train and do not take dietary creatine, you should expect an increase in about 8% over a training program. But if you take creatine, you get an increase in 20%. So that's a 12% increase. And that's just muscle strength, or your ability to perform a maximal contraction. Now we're actually seeing massive increases in muscle endurance, the ability to go to fatigue, muscle power, and then also reducing the risk of falls, fractures. And that's just in a healthy population. There's evidence in populations with osteoporosis or frailty that creatine has magical powers of bone density. So from an overall health perspective, creatine seems to be the best overall ingredient to take from a multifactorial component. But I know a lot of people, I want to get stronger, bigger, faster.
Yep.
Creatine is going to trump caffeine, and it's going to trump protein from those performance measures.
And then to add on top of that, because there's so many ways that we can unpack this, and I love the enthusiasm. I can always tell an individual, an educator who spends his time speaking sometimes in front of a general audience in order to inform them. I sense enthusiasm, and I'm totally on board. As soon as you said white powder monohydrate, I was already in. So I am part of the congregation right now, the Church of Muscle. I was going to ask the question. You said dietary creatine and then supplementing with creatine. Can you just break down where you said the individuals in that study, they were given 5 salmon steaks? What would be the average dietary intake for an individual, just with, let's say, a normal eating life, and then what would you need to take or ingest supplement-wise in order to get the appropriate levels of creatine?
So that's an excellent point. There's actually never been a single study where they actually looked at dietary creatine. So every study has been on the supplement, so a powder or a pill or whichever it is. The reason being is to get the amount of creatine that's usually prescribed, financially it would be through the roof, and then you actually have to give the people the food. So for example, a 5-gram dose, which is, I argue against it, but a lot of people say that's just an average general dose. That's going to be a salmon steak and a half or a large steak. Ethical issues regarding animals, maybe people are vegetarian. So to get that on a daily basis, a lot of issues come up, finances, things like that. So a lot of people say it's so much easier for me to go buy creatine monohydrate supplementation or creatine supplementation, take a little teaspoon, off I go, no big deal. So all the studies have been on supplementation because you also need to blind that with a placebo. So this is why you can't really use dietary creatine because it's found in a variety of foods. What are you going to give as a placebo? Because you always have to base all this on research. It can't be an opinion or bro science and all that nonsense. Everything we talk about today is based on peer-reviewed articles. So the reason there probably isn't a study on food is what are you going to give someone that has a masking amount of energy? It might have a different amount of protein, so then you get in all these caveats. The amount of, or the dosage that a lot of people purport is about 3 to 5 grams per day. Okay, so that would be a 1.5 serving of salmon or a large red meat steak. We don't do an absolute dosing because we've done studies, we base it on body weight. All 3 of us go on a scale, we're all going to be different size. It's like having a small coffee giving to 100 people. The amount of caffeine is going to affect someone differently. So we always use 0.1 gram per kilogram. You go on a scale, everybody in the study has a different dosage, but it's relative. It's like comparing an absolute VO2 max versus relative. It doesn't make sense. So yes, you can, for easy sake, you can give 5 grams a day, but I go on the scale, and if I'm 80 kilograms, I get 8 grams a day. If Eric's 100 kilograms, he gets 10 grams a day because he's so much bigger. So it's a really important thing for your viewers, exactly, for your viewers to say, you can actually take an absolute dose, but it's so easy to go on a scale and base the dosage off that. And I would say of the 55 studies we've published, I would bet all 55 have used a relative dose.
Okay.
And it seems to be effective. And here's the kicker. 0.1 gram per kilogram, and this is important for your viewers, leads to 0 side effects. No GI tract irritation, minimal water retention. It seems to be effective. The supplement companies say take 20 grams a day for 5 days. You pee out about 70% of that. And the reason they also want you to do that is because when you do 20 grams a day for 5 days, you need to go buy more creatine.
Right.
So it's a really effective way to load the muscle, but that's where people say, I gained 5 pounds of water retention. I have GI tract irritation. We've only done 2 studies with the loading phase, and that was because it was such a short term. I think on a basis, you can take an absolute amount. 5 grams is going to be really effective, but I always like to say, hey, you're all different. Let's do it based on body weight.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I think one thing, like I really appreciate that you were talking about the lack of studies we have on dietary creatine. I was thinking about it from a researcher perspective. If you wanted to do it, you'd have to do a number of things. One, you'd have to get, essentially to do effective control, you'd have to get an ethical allowance to deceive the subjects.
Correct.
So what you would do is go, hey, we're going to compare, salmon to a different protein source. And you'd probably have to use something that was not meat, so it didn't have creatine. So like an egg white or a whey protein versus salmon. And then you'd tell them, hey, we're comparing protein sources and not mention the fact they're getting creatine. But even another thing that's important, and though we haven't done direct studies on dietary sources of creatine, we do know that the cooking process degrades the creatine content of meat. So it's not even safe for all the really, really natty folks out there who don't want to even take supplements.
You're already taking it.
Yeah, it's exactly. But if you want to be the guy who doesn't take any supplements, and that's a fair concern now that we've seen more and more false positives, and
100%,
which is not an issue with creatine per se, but more the supplement industry and its quality of control. But if you were to say have salmon, the different cooking levels that are involved, you'd probably need to be going to the sushi bar to make sure that you're actually getting enough salmon.
And unlike protein, where you can get everything through your diet, because protein is found in so abundance, we can't conclude that you can get enough dietary creatine to be effective because no study's ever done it. Until a study does it, you just can't. You can speculate, but you just can't conclude that. So I can only base all this, what we're talking about today, on creatine supplementation. Again, to your point, it's deception and trying to get a group to say, and ethics boards do not like deceiving subjects more than based on minimal risk. So
yeah. You could do a study where you just were legitimately comparing whey versus salmon and saying we're not comparing creatine, and then in the discussion section you could say we think the differences are related to, and you can measure the creatine levels in subjects.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's ways to do it. Yep. For all you grad students.
Yeah, that's
out
right.
There. Yeah.
Listening. When you mentioned the salmon steaks, I immediately thought that individuals would probably be wondering about dietary consumption versus, ingesting via supplements. I do like, Darren, that you are essentially now my favorite type of drug dealer, which is that what you say about the supplement companies. It's like, oh, I'm not like that. Like so you bring me on the inside, right? You're not trying to give me the markup on the price when you're selling me the drugs. You're like, now wait a second, like this is wrong. You're educating, and then you're also, offering a service. So I love it. Continuing on that, you said one of your pet peeves were if someone was to ingest the appropriate amount of creatine is that there's virtually no side effects. One of the ones you said that was a pet peeve of yours was water retention, or people complaining about that. Can you just get into that a little bit? People talking about water retention and some of those other potential, in quotation, side effects.
People hate creatine because they say, hey, I gained lean tissue, or I gained mass, usually about 1 to 4 pounds a week. So unfortunately, a population that's so underrepresented in research is young females. We've tried, but as soon as they start gaining weight, they withdraw from the study. We're very successful with postmenopausal females because I don't know if they're so concerned with water retention. They're more looking for the health benefits. If you retain water, consider yourself a responder to creatine. You should high-five yourself and think this is very special. You want water retention because creatine is an osmotic property. And what creatine basically does when you consume it, it takes water from the bloodstream, surrounds the muscle, and when you think of a cell or a balloon, when you blow up the balloon, it gets larger. So you want your muscle proteins, primarily actin and myosin. If they're in an aqueous environment and you stretch or swell the cell, you induce protein synthesis. So the theory is that you want water retention. It increases the chance of cellular swelling. And only when you get a swelling to the cell do you increase transcription factors, satellite cells, insulin-like growth factor, so on and so forth, which we think can help explain the increase in muscle mass. The cell swelling to this date in humans has not increased the mTOR pathway. So unlike protein, which it does, protein obviously has a direct increase in muscle protein synthesis. So to Eric's point, protein will always be one of the most important macronutrients, if not the macronutrient you consume. Creatine works a little bit differently. It sort of brings in all those other factors that can increase muscle mass. So I think water retention or swelling from creatine is by far one of the most best and purported properties of it. However, people who are trying to cut weight, lose mass, they say, this is not for me, I'm going to get bigger. So it really comes down to what the person's trying to achieve. If you're trying to lose mass, my suggestion is just hang on, the water retention will subside. And if you get an increase in lean tissue mass, you might actually lose overall mass if you lose more body fat. But it's a big thing we wrestle with primarily in young females. And if they're vegetarian, they put on way more lean or water weight because they just have such low intramuscular creatine anyway. And they're not consuming animal products. So when you put in an animal-like substance through creatine, although creatine supplements are all plant-based, they derive it from plants because getting it from an animal's extract is so expensive. Our females usually withdraw. So it's an area that we need to do way more research on. Females might respond a bit differently to creatine supplementation. It seems like males seem to get a better bang for your dollar, so to speak. There's many reasons potentially for that. And it also could be that we lack females in creatine research.
Yeah, it's always difficult to tell whether there's a difference in effect when you're comparing a larger population of studies to a smaller one.
Yeah.
Just as a little aside, there was a long time where we had all the comparisons between high load and low load, high rep, low rep resistance training was primarily in men. And we had one study that seemed to indicate that women did not respond as well to high rep, low load training. And then in the last couple of years, like 3 more have been published, and we found that, that was just kind of a statistical aberration.
That's right.
Which happens all the time in our field, because a big study for us is a number like the power analysis you have to do in sports science. The ad hoc one is have double digits.
Yeah.
That counts as
Yeah.
power analysis.
And put it this way, every time your career, whatever it is, a lot of people say, oh, one study is the foundation. I always think one study is one piece of 1,000 jigsaw puzzle. And just because one study says this, you'll get the one the next day that says, we could even talk about 2 hours about protein timing. I did a study, it didn't work. Someone else comes out and says it did. There's so many factors. You need to almost have these meta-analysis or meta-regressions, but still, you keep adding to it. Yeah. And you almost need to have at least 100 studies that come together for a consensus. Right now, we can probably say we now have a good idea on the amount of protein, but man, oh man, of all the things we've done on creatine, we still don't know the optimal dose. We don't know if you should cycle it or take it every day. We don't know a lot of the effects, but yet there's been 1,000 studies. So I think it's why we get out of bed every day and we're eager to do this, because you just try to enhance science. And for the people listening, if they don't have a lot of education or they're getting their information from non-reputable sources, you could be swayed to be doing things that are harmful to the body or not working well. And it's just like a diet. Some diets work for some people and some don't. Ketogenic diet, low carb, it all is based on calorie deficit. However you get there is what you're trying to achieve.
Oh, Darren's right in this. Okay, he's part of the cult, and cult starts with C, just like creatine. We're out here proselytizing to the people, for the people. There's many questions, honestly, and I'm not just excited to talk about this because it is creatine, but I find it very interesting how there could be so many misconceptions. I posted recently, Minnesota in particular, the state, for some reason, for individuals, I think it's pronounced the Mayo Clinic,
yes, yeah.
Put out where there was a warning. They're talking about teens using performance-enhancing substances, and they threw creatine right underneath actual PEDs without a clear distinction for the average person. They did say that this is a supplement, so they did differentiate in their text. But if you were to have, and I had several individuals that did not know anything about creatine, steroids, just read it, their overall opinion on creatine was quite negative after reading the article. And so there's so much misinformation. If we could just back up, because this is the cult, but who knows who might listen to this now, 5 years from the future, 1,000 years, when this is the #1 podcast of all time. And it is a source. It is the source for information. Darren, if you can explain, or if you can try and talk about some of those negative side effects that are purported in the media that we see all too often. Can you just talk about them a little bit? So let's say, kidney damage, or there could be other deleterious effects that we hear. So can you just talk about some of those, and why you think also afterwards, after you explain it, why you think we hear about it so much in the media?
Yeah. Again, I would actually I totally agree. It's media or anecdotal reports. We had NCAA wrestlers wearing rubber suits about a decade ago, taking massive amounts of creatine, but they were taking a whole bunch of other things. The media says, their death was due to creatine. So if you understand the metabolism of creatine, it's very similar to protein. It comes in the body and it gets filtered through the liver and kidney. So the theory is, if you take a supplement, you're going to really kill the function of your liver or kidney. We've done randomized clinical trials in young and aging populations. We see zero effects on blood, kidney, liver, cardiovascular strain, or other abnormalities compared to placebo. So if you have a placebo control, then you're just looking at the maturation of the human. The only big side effects we've already talked about is water retention, and some people can get GI tract irritation. So, if you do take a loading phase, that's 20 grams a day. We produce about 2 grams, right? So that's 10 times as much. Obviously, the body could respond in some adverse ways. So common side effects during a loading phase are GI tract irritation, bloating. Some people suffer headaches. They become dehydrated. So these are anecdotal effects that we see. But when we've looked at all our position stands and medical papers, there's no scientific or clinical evidence to suggest that it increases kidney or liver failure, dysregulation, has no cardiovascular strain. There's nothing from increasing stroke, type 2 diabetes. If anything, it actually deteriorates or decreases those risks. It has phenomenal beneficial effects now for cognitive health, sleep deprivation in students, because it finally can get across the blood-brain barrier. You just need more. There's potential for neuromuscular rehabilitation. We now know the benefits for osteoporosis, frailty, and we're doing a study right now on stroke rehabilitation, because when you look at people with stroke, type 2 diabetes, they suffer massive muscle loss, bone density loss, muscle performance. So can we increase the rehabilitation processes? Creatine is always looked at from a negative standpoint, primarily from uneducated individuals. I can't stress enough to your viewers, if you're going to take creatine, please become educated, read peer-refereed journal articles, look at position stands, make sure you have an unbiased or at least educated position. The problem by going to your GP or doctor, they're going to know what creatine is, but they're probably, and I use the word probably loosely, they may not be up to date on research. They will know that when creatine comes into the body, it gets filtered through their kidneys. You actually want to have a high creatine filtration rate. A lot of doctors think you want a low rate. No, you want to clear it from the body quite easily. A lot of MDs get confused over the high filtration rate versus lower rate. Again, of all the clinical studies, Mark Tarnopolsky at McMaster University, one of the world's top physiologists, he's looked at it from mitochondrial myopathies in children. We've done RCTs out here in Saskatchewan in aging individuals. We don't see any adverse effects. Every now and then you do, but when you compare it to placebo, you don't get any extra. So I would consider it to probably be the safest, most effective ergogenic aid on the planet.
And I would also like to point out a few other interesting tidbits. If you talk to any sports nutritionist, they'll normally say, the big two are caffeine and creatine. Mm-hmm. That's what we have the evidence for. That's what you want to look at. But an interesting thing for those who are iron enthusiasts, for those who are lifters, who are trying to get bigger, there's actually not a single longitudinal study on caffeine's impact on hypertrophy, which is actually interesting. So again, for all you master's students or future PhD students who are listening, we have a ton of acute data showing enhances in strength from caffeine and how it affects kind of a one-off performance as a stimulant. But what we do have for creatine is a ton of longitudinal data showing both hypertrophy and strength adaptations. But one thing that is always a little dangerous to do is to take acute studies and then extrapolate that, therefore those effects on performance are going to have a knock-on effect on hypertrophy. You don't have to do that with creatine, which is interesting.
And to that point, my master's student has almost finished that design. I couldn't believe it. So we're looking at a 4-group creatine and caffeine, caffeine alone, and placebo. He could only get it for 6 weeks of resistance training. So even the results to see the effects of caffeine alone on the effects of hypertrophy, because 2 new studies came out. It didn't impair mTOR, but it can potentially increase muscle mass. The theory, I think, with caffeine, and caffeine is my go-to, if it increases alertness, and I really like how it dysregulates calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, if it can really increase muscle function, the person should be able to increase muscle performance, leading to hypertrophy. So it may not have a direct effect, but it doesn't look like it's going to inhibit protein synthesis. And then that goes to the debate. What about all this we hear combining caffeine and creatine? So the theory there was that they oppose each other at something called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Caffeine basically releases calcium quickly, and creatine likes to suck it back up. So it was like a tug of war. The studies that it shows they oppose one another was only during acute creatine loading. So only when caffeine was added during the last parts of a loading phase, they seem to impair one another. However, no study, to your point, has looked at the effects long term, and is crucially needed because you have pre-workouts. What's the 2 main ingredients? Caffeine and creatine. Other people say, well, I can't work out unless I'm caffeinated, and then I guess I can take creatine after, right? And I'm like, well, sure, why wouldn't you? Well, I heard this. So there's a lot of nuances out there. The pre-supplements has taken the world by storm, and usually you're going to have some caffeine or creatine property in there. You'll have beta-alanine and nitrates and branched-chain amino acids. But my favorite pre-workout is coffee. And then some people, we've done studies, can you take creatine before or after? Yeah, you get the same beneficial effect. You get a slightly better effect if you take creatine after. So I say if you're worried about it, just split them up. Eric Drexler, I think, was on your show before. He's done a great meta-analysis on the effects with Ryan Smith. You look at the data, and I think people, or a lot of individuals, don't read it or comprehend. They just say, oh, we can't take it together. So you got to be obviously informed on the benefit of both. You can take both, obviously. The studies that have showed the beneficial effects, they put their creatine in a warm tea or coffee. But it's during the loading phase, it almost seems to saturate the body. So again, if you don't do the loading phase, in theory, you should have no adverse effects. Yeah, and we're doing that study right now, and hopefully we'll write that up for publication in the new year.
Well, that's exciting. So I've also got there's a student at Fullerton who's looking at that.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see when that stuff starts to come out. It'll almost go counter to what was previously believed. So that's exciting. I think it's cool to see that we're still getting new research coming out on the way that creatine can impact the body, the way it interacts with things. Some stuff that we've really only had speculative acute data on, like you said, during the loading phase. I think some of the most interesting stuff, anyone who's read the recent position stand by the ISSN on creatine, there's almost a recommendation for adolescent like concussion or combat athletes, like your standard gridiron player who's in high school, to take creatine. And that is something that I think 10 years ago you wouldn't have just not gone through peer review. They would have found you, strung you up, and burned you to death. It's
almost like a preventative maintenance. Eric Rawson, who's here tomorrow, or he'll speak on Saturday, but the potential benefits is not just about muscle. I would highly recommend or speculate that all the NCAA and maybe the NFL, especially with everything going on with CTE, obviously down in Australia and New Zealand with rugby, anything hit to the head, obviously. The issue is how do you do it? So you give everybody creatine. Sadly, you're almost in hope they get a concussion and then they're randomized. Well, obviously, what you would want to do is give all athletes creatine beforehand. Then when they get a concussion versus a placebo, you would look at the rate of change. But there's good evidence that have come out in the last probably 5 years of the cognitive and brain health benefits of creatine. So now you start to look at, well, what's more important are populations. Dementia, Alzheimer's, anything like that is a huge area. Our next RCT will be in type 2 diabetics, because they have a massive loss of muscle mass and potential now with creatine and fat loss. That might be a way to, well, hopefully attenuate some of the symptoms of the global epidemic. So it's almost gone from an athlete to a medical intervention, but it still has promise for both. So it's fantastic,
Yeah, one thing that I find it speaks to human nature is that this isn't necessarily something that if a bunch of sports nutrition scientists hung out together, they would have said this 5-10 years ago. But it simply was not allowed to be said. You know, telling a high school student to take creatine was just like irresponsible. And when you ask someone why, they might be able to talk about supplements broadly. And you could make an argument that some of the manufacturing issues, but I think that's a separate issue. But it just goes to show you how much the media can have sometimes. Well, it can have an effect on society. You know, so when the Bash brothers back in the late 80s, the early 90s, Mark McGuire, Jose Canseco, playing for the A's.
That's right, yeah.
You know, and they came out and they said, hey, we're not taking anabolic steroids, we're taking andro and creatine. To be fair, I bet you they'd taken all three. And I remember that happening as a young kid, and then that totally changed the conversation. And then shortly after, we saw, you know, the legislation change in the United States. Right. And somehow creatine has been lumped in with that. And it's crazy to me that it's taken now 30 years.
At least.
Before that stigma has gone back to the point where scientific bodies, not the general public, like you said, the Mayo Clinic isn't talking like this. But like even the ISSN, arguably the most liberally minded scientific group as far as supplements, is saying, hey, we should be taking this for neuroprotective benefits in adolescent athletes.
There's not a population that has been shown not to benefit. Even pregnancy. Haley Dickinson from Australia, the probably the world's greatest researcher from creatine, looking at embryos and increasing energy metabolism for development. So you look at fetal development all the way up to the frail elderly, cachexia. Potential for cancer, HIV. So it has anti-inflammatory properties that we haven't got into. So the theory with creatine is, I still hear it, it's a steroid. And not only does it have potential anabolic effects, but I would argue the beneficial effects come from being anti-catabolic. It decreases protein breakdown, it increases recovery, and it substantially decreases inflammation. So when you look at an aging population who are always sore or inflamed, arthritis, it seems to be an anabolic per se, but more so anti-catabolic. So anybody that has surgery or inflammation, anything like that, it can be considered. We're not here to say go out and buy a big container of creatine and hope for the best. But hopefully it's just giving information about the potential of it, and a lot of misnomers about the downfall or what it is. It's not a steroid. It's a natural product very common. You're probably consuming it and you didn't even know. When you have red meat, seafood, trace amounts in poultry and trace amounts in milk, you're consuming it, you just didn't know. Yeah,
that's the title right there. Creatine. You're taking this designer steroid and you don't even know about it. It is fascinating.
You don't even know.
Yeah, it is fascinating where if you were talking to the average person, they would probably say, if they didn't know any better, just based on the media perception, that creatine probably has more negative effects than something like alcohol, which is ubiquitous in our society and something that we consume on a regular basis. And, you know, you might try and bring up the statistics of the amount of drunk driving incidents or accidents and all these things, and how, as you said, there are virtually under a safe consumption no side effects or no negative side effects of creatine, yet that perception, how perception could be everything instead of the reality. And so I think what I want to ask you, Darren, is I've been fascinated because I've been more interested as it relates to performance with creatine, but hearing about all these potential health benefits for someone, let's just assume we could bracket the performance enhancing side, like the side where it might assist you with your training. Can we then talk about what would your best pitch be for someone who is just after, in quotations, overall health, however we define that, your best pitch for taking creatine, and then explain some of those mechanisms you're talking about before of how it potentially works.
Yep. So one of the things we're all going to suffer from is sarcopenia or muscle wasting. It's one of those conditions that as every day you get out of bed, you're a day older. So it's the poverty of flesh, and we really start to see it accelerate around the end of the fourth decade. So we think at the age of 50, we are really susceptible to muscle loss. And of course, therefore, muscle performance, strength, endurance, power goes down. If the muscle gets smaller, you have less mechanical strain on the bone. So then your skeleton starts to decrease. You're more susceptible to falls, fracture, hip replacement surgery. Then you're more susceptible to frailty, cachexia. And then you're, at the end of it, you're probably at a greater risk for living in long-term care facilities, using assistive devices to engage in daily activities. So if you look at all those downfalls of aging, and there's probably nothing beneficial about the biological process of aging, combine that with the oxidative stress or the impairments leading to cancer, metabolic diseases, obesity, so on and so forth, everything that I just mentioned, creatine potentially has a beneficial effect. So you almost look at it from not a multivitamin, like a Flintstone vitamin, it's one of those things that probably has a lot of health potential benefits. Do you get benefits from creatine alone without exercise? Yes, but my God, do you ever get way more when you combine it with exercise, primarily resistance training? You need that mechanical stimuli from resistance training to try to cause a lot of muscle and bone mass to grow, and then you get stronger, bigger, faster. You can be 120 years of age, you can be a child. They still do benefit from dietary creatine in the form of supplementation. Another way to look at it, anytime if someone doesn't want to take a supplement, anytime you're eating meals, you may want to focus on creatine-enriched food, seafood. If you consume red meat, there's an easy opportunity. The timing of creatine is a little bit different than the timing of protein, but I will say there is evidence that when you combine creatine with protein, primarily whey, you get a synergistic effect because protein increases protein synthesis and decreases breakdown. So anytime the viewers can combine creatine and protein, you will get a greater increase on muscle mass and muscle performance. If you combine the two, creatine will trump protein from a muscle performance standpoint, but protein has a greater increase on muscle mass directly. So there is evidence in young and older individuals, and we've done studies in both, that when you combine like creatine in your protein shake after you work out, you should expect even greater benefits. I can't actually think of a population on the planet that wouldn't benefit from additional creatine. I'm struggling to find a population that won't benefit from some aspect of it.
I now know what I'm getting my grandmother for Christmas.
That's right.
500 grams,
seriously.
a tub, just like, here you go.
And sorry, we just finished a 5-year clinical trial. It started in 2013, and we looked at 200 postmenopausal females, and they resistance trained daily, 3 times a week, took creatine, and then we followed them to see how many times they fell. The theory is that creatine increased bone density, so if you fall, you won't suffer as much fracture. We're just analyzing the data now, but that's the longest study to date that has looked at it in the human population from a musculoskeletal perspective. So we're really hoping that creatine increases potentially more than placebo. It'll be all unbiased when it's results because you never know, right? So it's the effect there. The dose with older people, I speculate we need more. It's kind of like this anabolic resistance that you hear of with dietary protein. I almost think we need more of a dose. So maybe instead of 0.1 grams per kilogram, older adults might need 0.15. Maybe they need more than 10 or 12 because since they're deteriorating, they might need more creatine to offset the rate of loss. And until we do those escalating dose studies, it's speculative, but I think some of our studies where we see, geez, there was good results, but if we gave more, would it be better? Then, of course, the counter argument, would that higher dose lead to more side effects? Until we do the studies, it's only speculative, yeah.
And there's a couple of good points in there. One is that I think it's really important for people to understand that the populations do change the effects of these things, you know, not just in creatine. So for example, NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, if you look at the effects of chronic use in younger lifters, they actually can impede the cascade that results in hypertrophy. But then, like Dr. Kanda was talking about, in populations with chronic inflammation, if you look at older individuals who take the same dosage of the same drugs, they will actually enhance hypertrophy. And you could look at the same thing as far as performance when you're talking about antioxidants.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
So not only do we have to think about, the effect of a given compound specific to the population, but that it may change with dosage. And then the other thing, speaking of dosage, is, and this is where I'm going to go back and I'm going to take, I won that debate where we started.
He did.
I said that, even if creatine is better than protein, it's because it's
a protein derivative.
It's a protein derivative,
That's right. Yeah.
Self-declaring that you win is always the best way to be sure that you won.
I've learned from the great American the debaters that are currently on television a lot that we all agree are the best. And I will just say that I'm going to go back and I'm going to be the humblest person in the room, and then and then take my win away and give it back to Dr. Kanda. Because from a practical perspective, even though creatine is a protein derivative, like you were saying, the reality is that almost anyone who is not a vegetarian, without dietary restriction, who is interested in lifting and who comes from a Western diet, is more than likely reaching an intake of protein that, if not already optimal, is so close that when you go from, let's say you're at 1.5 grams per kilogram of protein, if you go up to say 1.8 or 2 grams per kg, we're talking about a trivial effect. Maybe it would manifest over years. But if you're not taking creatine and you do start to take it, you probably will see measurable benefits for sure. So the win goes back to you.
But now I will, because I hate losing, I'm going to do the next study we're going to do. We're going to get people to acclimatize to a low protein dose.
This.
We're going to give them creatine and offset it and see can creatine resurrect or offset the negative nitrogen balance. That's the next one I'll get a study. And it's a good study.
Purely to win the debate.
Purely to win so I can come back, in 100 years when we air that.
So a battle may have been won today, but Darren's going to win the war. Is what you don't know. You just started a war, Eric.
Exactly.
You won a battle.
But I love the point with vegetarians because plant-based diets are so popular, so healthy, and speculation goes, geez, can I get enough protein? And of course you can get enough protein if you focus on leucine but at the end of it, and I talk on Saturday about this, if you're getting the max, what are we, around 2.2 grams per kilogram or a gram per pound, the timing's really not going to matter because you're going to have to do protein pacing. You have a muscle full effect, so you can't eat that in one meal. You're probably going to get a leucine threshold if you eat quinoa, hemp, all those complete proteins. So at the end of it, protein has kind of gone from so stressful to one of the easiest. Just eat enough, you're probably going to get enough. But it's funny when people say protein timing is not important. It's those people that I'd be shocked if they didn't eat as soon as possible after resistance training. Because I think it's one of the best ways to refuel, recharge the body. Maybe the timing is not crucial. They talk about this window of opportunity. I love eating right after because I think everything's depleted. It's just an easy strategy to get to that daily amount. Will you deflate? No. You see people in the change room, they might as well bring in a blender and throw a salmon in. I always laugh at people that they think they're going to deflate all their muscles. So the timing of protein is not as we once thought it was hyped up. But interesting with the timing of creatine, there's only been 4 studies done, and we've published 3 of those, and we don't see any difference between pre-exercise and post when it comes to performance. So if someone says, I'm going to throw this in my yogurt before I work out, fantastic. You should expect phenomenal benefit. I'm going to throw it in a shake or my meal afterwards. You should expect phenomenal benefits to strength, power, and endurance. But funny, when we looked at the muscle mass gains, post-exercise creatine seemed to increase muscle mass a little bit better. Both improved, but then I was thinking, what are the mechanisms, to your point? Usually transcription factors, satellite cells, everything is turned on and there's a delay. So when you're in the gym flexing and all that, you're actually breaking down the muscle and you want to start the recovery process quicker. So I think some of the theories, if you take creatine, immediately after exercise or within a couple hours, it seems to cause a signal where blood flow to the muscle is still going. It might turn on recovery processes faster. But again, we've only looked at in one study, and that was in aging adults. It had no difference when it came to bone density. But older adults put on more muscle mass compared to placebo if they took it after as compared to beforehand. In the bottom, at the end of the day, it probably doesn't matter. If you're taking a dose of creatine in close proximity, Paul Cribb did a great study when they looked at it morning and evening versus around protein or exercise. So I think creatine is one just like caffeine. It makes no sense to consume caffeine 4 hours before exercising because it's going to be dissipating in the blood. Creatine is one of those that you can consume around exercise and have it in your post-exercise meal. It's a simple, easy way to do it, or beforehand. It's one of those things that comes down to what's consistent or achievable for that person. Some people don't like working or eating before they work out. They get GI tract irritation, no problem. But we actually have the first study ever going on right now. We're replacing the branched-chain amino acid mentality where they're consuming it. They're actually consuming a mouthful of creatine or protein after every set, placebo after every set. So I'm thinking creatine intra-workout might be a new strategy to help people achieve their goals. So we have people doing a bodybuilding program, young athletes. They're consuming 32 mouthfuls of creatine or placebo after 32 sets per workout. So they're taking the same amount of creatine after. So, you see people drink branched chain amino acids after every set. Get that away. I want to see, can blood flow increase during a set, act as a vehicle to get the creatine in the muscle, and then over time, could that allow you to lift bigger, stronger, more weight? So it'll be the first intra-workout with creatine supplementation. Then, of course, that leads, now I got to go back and do a study comparing pre, during, and after to see which one was best. Right.
So you got your whole career mapped out.
You got the whole career mapped out for the next 20 years. Yeah, it's crazy.
So how much total creatine are they taking in that intra-workout?
0.1 grams per kilogram. So everybody's on a scale, and we divide it by 32. So it works out to be some 0.001 grams. It's not even a gram, obviously, after every set. We were going to do it after every exercise, but we said, no, we see a common practice. People will take a sip of branched chain amino acids or milk or something. Maybe creatine is an easy thing because it dissolves in water so easy that you're like, geez, I don't have time because I got to get to work, but I'm drinking water anyway. Why not mix it in? It dissolves. Who knows? It might have some beneficial effects. So those results will be in the new year as well, too. So,
Darren, we now have to talk about those people and those people that are listening right now to this episode. They're super excited. If before they thought to themselves, maybe they read examine.com, maybe they saw the video that Eric did on my channel about creatine, where they're excited, they're already bought in, and now they're hearing even more all these potential benefits.
Okay.
And they're super excited, but they feel like, and feelings here are important, that they're non-responders, that they're not responding well, or they don't see. So they hear what you're saying and they see the studies, but in terms of what they personally experience, they don't see that happen. And so they'd classify themselves as non-responders. Can you just talk about the whole concept of creatine non-responders, what it means, and if it is indeed a thing, how to try and determine if you are or not?
Yeah, it's great timing because we published a paper last month in Frontiers Nutrition, a special edition on variables that affect creatine supplementation. And next year at ISSN in Florida, I'll be giving a presentation on this. And it's actually pretty clear cut. There are non-responders. So you measure that by the percent improvement in intramuscular content and or performance. So they're quite apparent. Number one is your initial phosphocreatine levels. So that's the amount that's naturally in your body. Everybody is different. If you are a vegetarian, you have the lowest amount. So for those vegetarians listening, you respond the best on the planet. For those vegetarians who take supplemental creatine, and the nice thing is it's derived from plant-based amino acids, it's totally easy to consume. You should expect the greatest benefits. Those who eat a lot of red meat or seafood, those are typically the non-responders because your muscle is saturated. It has so much already, you kind of just excrete it down the toilet. So when people say, oh man, I didn't respond to creatine, if you look at their diet, it's probably because they have a lot naturally.
They're chilling at Sushi Train.
Exactly. So there, your niche, and then aging, we're not sure. We think as we get older, we have a reduction in your intramuscular creatine. So the theory is that aging adults may respond better than a younger population, but the jury is still out there. So number one, by far, is your initial amount that's in your body. Number two, for those who have a science background, it's the type 2 muscle fiber composition and size. So type 2 muscle fibers, if you go under your skin, are the ones that allow you to lift super heavy weight, allow individuals to be super strong and powerful. Type 1 muscle fibers are the ones you're using walking, breathing. Marathon runners would have a high proportion of type 1 muscle fibers. So the Olympic powerlifters, bodybuilders, they typically have more type 2 muscle fibers. If you have more type 2 muscle fibers, that's where creatine likes to live. You will respond better. And the only way we can determine this is to do a muscle biopsy. So most people say, geez, I don't know how to do that. So that's another really important thing from a science perspective. For the average person, they'll never be able to determine that. But if you notice that you're really strong, you can put on muscle mass, and you're quite powerful, there's a good chance you have a higher proportion of these type 2 muscle fibers in your body. But if you say, I'm not strong, but I can go out and run for an hour, no problem, you'd have a higher amount of type 1. You probably won't respond as well. Okay, so type 2 muscle fibers in the body respond the best, and they're more anaerobic. So again, number one is your initial phosphocreatine levels. 2 is the amount of muscle fibers you're born with. And I'm sure with stem cell research, cloning, they'll be implementing type 2 muscle fibers in people down the road. And number 3 is your habitual diet. So if you're already eating a lot of dietary creatine from red meat or seafood, you should respond less. Again, vegetarians, we've done studies, their phosphocreatine goes through the roof, their energy goes through the roof, and the percent change from baseline over time is the highest. The fourth is probably getting into important, but not really that important variables. Do you combine it with protein to get the synergistic effect? When are you consuming it? We've shown that you get greater benefits when you consume it in close proximity to exercise. And then we get into the type of creatine. This is important for your audience especially. The only type of creatine that has been shown consistently from research to work is monohydrate, and that's because we want the creatine molecule linked to water to cause the water retention, to cause the cell swelling. Creatine citrate, pyruvate, every now and then a study will show beneficial effects. Purple K was designed to have no water retention. I'm not sure the principles of that because you kind of want it stimulating. I can only talk about monohydrate because that's all that research promotes. There's a lot of variations out there. Some say they have a greater upregulation, but when it comes to the overall body of evidence, monohydrate seems to be the most effective. And my guess is most products out there are monohydrate derived.
Yeah, to add on to that, I would say we're out of the era now where supplement companies are trying to reinvent creatine as a way of making money. But man, in the 2000s, all the way up to say 2010, 12, you had crealkaline, creatine ethyl ester, ready to drink creatines that had already been degraded down to creatinine.
Yep.
And those are kind of the three big ones you want to avoid if you still see it. So creatine ethyl ester and crealkaline have both been shown to be actually inferior to monohydrate. Right. And then in anything where you see it's a ready to drink creatine, at least from the manufacturing process they had a few years back, those would have already degraded into the byproduct of creatine and would not be effective. So
I know the big one right now is Bang, and I'm not sure if they've come up with new technology, but it lists creatine, so I'm not sure. My understanding is creatine is not stable in solution, but maybe there's new technology. But all the studies we do are based on the powder. Yeah, powder form, mixing in water that way.
Yeah, and that's definitely. It's also the cheapest, which is why no surprise that.
It is cheap. It's cheap.
It's very cheap. You can get so much creatine for a long period of time in powder form. And you'll notice another thing is that by avoiding these non-straight up powder forms of creatine monohydrate, you're saving a lot of money. So when you look at some of the other forms of creatine, they're astronomically upticked in their price compared to regular monohydrate.
And we only use 100% pharmaceutical grade creatine that's tested by third parties because a lot of supplements out there will have about 15 different ingredients. And we don't know if it interferes with the bioavailability. Does it lead to side effects? You know, if it's got lipoic acid in there, branched chain amino acids, caffeine, creatine, proteins, all these things. We don't know the effects. And so the evidence is still out on pre-supplements because you can never conclude what's the ingredient that caused it to work. Yeah. Because you need to have a group that has each ingredient. So the consumer needs to be hopefully educated on what each ingredient potentially does. At the end of the day, there's only a handful that have been shown on an individual basis and together to work. It's going to be creatine, protein for sure. Omega-3 is getting a lot of press potentially for recovery. Calcium and vitamin D used to get a lot of press, but they're sort of sidekicks, if you will. But caffeine is going to be one of the biggest stimulants. At the end of the day, of the 1,000 that are out there, there's probably only 5 that actually have been shown to work on a regular basis. And most are in our food.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like most are in food products we eat on a regular basis.
Yeah, you consume salmon, you've actually gotten like 3 of those. So.
Absolutely. And then I even think most of them have trace amounts of vitamin D, right? So I always choose seafood, high natural omega-3, polyunsaturated fatty acids. When you combine protein with omega-3, the study done in UK a while ago, it turned on the mTOR pathway, which is the main driver for protein synthesis, has natural creatine. So anytime I'm at a restaurant, I try to choose fatty fish. And people say, oh my God, you use the word fat. No, there's a difference. And I think a lot of us are well averse now on the beneficial effects of legumes and almonds and the unsaturated fatty acids. But you only need about 5 to 6 grams of unsaturated fats from omega-3s a day. It's easy to get naturally through the diet. Hemp, quinoa, plant-based proteins have phenomenal amounts. So it's not as difficult as people think. I strongly promote it naturally through food products. But again, with creatine, the cost comes down. So it really comes down to the person trying to achieve it. Yeah.
Yeah. And the potential degradation through cooking.
Absolutely. Yep.
You know, so you got to like sushi or pretty rare salmon, which you got to be careful with.
Yes.
Omar, to your point about those who experience themselves to be non-responders, I think this opens up a meta discussion of what you can expect out of supplements. Right. Even when we're talking about, you know, a supplement like creatine that has such a huge effect. It's important to understand that you may not even notice the difference of being, especially if you're a lifter who's already training and you're making strength gains, adding in creatine, you might have a good mesocycle, you know, but it's not as though every mesocycle is going to give you 20% versus 8%. It's just that first one. Once you become saturated, then you're going to go back to your normal rate of progress, even if that initial bump was there.
And to that point, it's amazing. We still haven't answered this. I get it almost on a daily basis. Should I cycle creatine or take it every day? There was one study that sort of looked at it really acutely. And the theory is that if you take creatine through a supplementation, you downregulate your natural production. We have not shown any downregulation or harmful effects from 2 years of consistent creatine supplementation. But we don't know. Should you cycle it to get that extra boost or take it on a daily basis? The jury's still out there. It's an interesting thing where it's another easy study to do, but people say, oh, should you take it for 4 weeks? I'm like, why can't you take it every day? But maybe financially, or you're trying to do something specifically in a program, absolutely. So I always take time off if I'm vacationing in Mexico or whichever it is. You kind of like just take a break and then it motivates you to get back in it. I would speculate the muscle probably becomes desensitized, just like muscle loading. You need to go through periods of desensitization or unloading to sort of sensitize it back in. I think Brant Schoenfeld talked about that the other day in a post on Instagram. And it makes sense because sometimes when you take a time off, you might psychologically say, geez, I'm missing the gym. And when you go back, you almost get greater gains, right? So I would speculate that cycling a creatine might give in the run of a year a little bit better, but until we do that study now, geez, I got all this work to do. I got to get all these grad students to keep doing it. But it's true, right? Because we do all this research, but then sometimes we negate or neglect the most basic question that everybody cares about, right? So it's an interesting thought, but yeah, time will tell.
One other thing on whether you notice this or not, I know we have a lot of competitive lifters or people who are interested in improving their squat, bench, deadlift, or even strongmen, women, stone lifts. The more technically skilled the lift, the less of a measurable benefit you'll see in terms of effect sizes from creatine. If you're talking about an isokinetic dynamometer or a simple task, measurement of just kind of quote-unquote raw force output, it's going to be more apparent because there's less of a skill component. But the more you see a complex task, then the effect sizes are typically lower in the meta-analyses. So If you're a powerlifter currently and you're not taking creatine, don't expect your squat to go up automatically to 30 kilos in a single mesocycle. But it will still show up, that's for sure.
And to your point, because I know you're a competitive bodybuilder, I actually don't know, would a competitive bodybuilder cutting weight take creatine to maintain muscle mass? I know protein is there, but I don't know. If you're in a caloric deficit, still training, can creatine help maintain muscle? If it decreases breakdown, my guess is yes. But then if it leads to water retention, so I wonder about that. Or could it, in hypocaloric environments, be beneficial to decrease the rate of loss? I wonder,
Yeah, I think, well, we don't have great research in dieting populations, but I would say, theoretically, the same process by which we build muscle is the process by which we maintain it in diet. It's just coming down to that net synthesis or net protein balance, you could say. So I would speculate, and I absolutely do and recommend taking creatine for bodybuilders during the competition season. The one thing I would recommend against is actually loading creatine in the week of your competition. You wouldn't want to do that.
The water retention,
But the water retention, the vast majority of the water retention you get when you're not doing a loading dose should be the kind of water retention a bodybuilder wants.
That's right, That's good to know,
And from an in the trenches coaching perspective, for everyone out there who has clients who, let's say they haven't started taking creatine, they don't take creatine, and they come to you to hire you to do a contest prep with them, and you want to have them actually start taking creatine, the way I'd actually recommend it is actually loading it. Because if you were to take a quote-unquote maintenance dose, you might have a period of, say, 3 to 4 weeks where you're slowly gaining weight, but you're also slowly losing body fat. So the scale will look stalled. And you'll think, oh, I'm not dieting right. And you'll make a inadvisable or unnecessary adjustment to your calories or do more cardio or something like that. But if you load, within a week, it's going to be a little uncomfortable and your scale's going to go up. But you just basically ignore your prior weigh-ins and you set a new baseline. And I've done this with actually some high-level bodybuilders. I had a guy I coached back in, I want to say 2012. He's just one of the few bodybuilders I'd met who was at a very high level, gunning for his natural pro card, and had not taken creatine yet. And I was like, really?
Wow.
And so we loaded him in the middle of prep. He gained 2 pounds and then started losing from there and just looked fuller. So it was kind of cool to see. That was the one time I got to do that. But I was glad that I had him load, because it only gave me 1 week of data I couldn't trust as far as weight loss.
And that's a phenomenal point we haven't talked about. If you saturate the muscle with a loading phase and stop, the benefits, and this is important for the viewers, last 4 weeks post. So in a young population, your intramuscular creatine that was elevated stays elevated for 4 weeks. So the benefits last a month later. In aging population, we've seen it retain for about 12 weeks, but we didn't do muscle biopsies. So going back to people cycling or loading, people think, oh, if I stop, will I lose it all? No. Compared to a placebo, the benefits in strength and muscle mass are elevated for 4 weeks after you stop taking it. So that's a crucial thing to know, especially for acute competitions,
Has anyone ever, and you would know this, has anyone ever compared taking it and going off for 4 weeks compared to someone maintaining a maintenance dose?
No, and that's what the one we're talking about, continuous. It's easy to do. No one's done it.
Because that would be
interesting. It's easy to do,
If the group that had taken creatine through a loading phase 4 weeks ago dropped more water weight than the group that is maintaining it, but had similar strength gains, then that's actually a weight cutting strategy for any weight class restricted strength.
And I tried to get a couple students to do that. It just didn't work because you kind of have to do it in cycles. You almost take it for 4 weeks, take it off for 4 weeks, measure them, and then go back on it to see if the rebound effect, where you get the other group who has a placebo load, and then you need a group who's just taking the 3 grams. So you could take 3 grams a day of creatine, and it takes about 30 days to potentially saturate the muscle compared to the 20 gram. But in 3 grams, you're not getting any side effects. So that really low dose can be just as effective. It's just going to take you way longer. But to your point, we haven't looked at the load or the burst of creatine versus the small. It's kind of like the tortoise and the hare. We haven't looked at the small gradual effect. Is that any better or detrimental from a performance standpoint? So that's an important thing,
Yes, because for any weight class restricted strength athlete, if you can do something to lose weight but maintain strength, even if it might be suboptimal in the long run, like going temporarily on a low carb diet, or maybe temporarily not taking creatine, maybe then that's a potential way to.
And then it brings in your the protein, right? It's so crucial because it has a potential dehydrating effect with the nitrogen excretion. And then the keto, everything is just interesting. Every day we wake up, it's changing, right? And it's hard to keep up, but that's why I rely on science for all the viewers.
Well, I like how, Eric, you brought up the fact individuals that might label themselves as non-responders, it's also important to set the correct expectations. I could say safely from reading some of the comments in my comment section over time, I think based on the label of the supplement they buy or what they've heard, they're expecting X effect. And when that is not fulfilled, they assume that they're a non-responder. It's very much real, as you said, Darren, that there are non-responders. But I think there is a certain category of individuals that will self-identify as a non-responder, but really it's not having realistic expectations. So I thought that was a very good point. Yeah.
Creatine will be the icing on the cupcake. You need to exercise. Exercise causes a multi-cascade effects to the body. Creatine is just the icing on the cake. You can't take creatine and expect you to gain substantial muscle mass and strength. You need the resistance train primarily. There is some evidence with HIIT training that creatine might be potentially beneficial because it's so high intense. But just like protein, just like anything, you need to exercise. So I can't stress this enough. Don't go out and buy creatine and think it's going to be magic. It has magical powers only if you put the work in. If you're training twice a day, 3 times a day, 7 days a week, it's only going to help. So again, it's not magic. It has magical powers only if you put the work in. So I think a lot of people say, oh, I bought this and it didn't work. Because you got to put the time in. Exercise is the foundation of youth. I always argue exercise is better than medicine. Okay, it's not medicine. It's way better than medicine. And just creatine and protein will be just the sprinkles and the icing on the cake. You still got to do all the work. I'd be shocked if someone says they bought supplements and replaced exercise. It really, you get 1% of the benefits compared to 100% when you exercise and do the effects.
Yeah, I only sent in my supplementary tax forms this year, and I'm expecting to have no issue with the IRS. So,
hey, makes it any public admission here once again on Iron Culture, as we know, because we're merely Eric hosts. Nothing here.
Not you.
Yeah, we're completely in the clear. It's fine.
In Canada, we're different. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're in another country too, so you're good, man. You're good. That just slipped by. That those that are listening that are part of the IRS, you're totally not going to be audited.
Sweet. I made it.
I want to know, Darren, now that basically via our conversation, you've determined there are 30 more studies you need to do.
Yes.
I want to open this up now to the end of the conversation to talk about the missing gaps in research as it relates to creatine, where you personally would want to see it go, and what are some of the biggest, as of yet, unanswered questions as it relates to creatine.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. So one of the first things is we still don't know the optimal dose to optimize muscle mass, muscle performance. We speculate with certain dosages, but we still don't know the best optimal dose. So that would be one. The other one we talked about, does cycling creatine have any different effect than the maintenance or continuous ingestion? You'd almost have to do a 6 month to a year study of multiple cycles with a large population. A lot of our studies are limited. The third is we need to get into the clinical aspects and become more conclusive on any clinical ramifications on bone density, offsetting potential implications of type 2 diabetes. And the big one is cognitive and concussion. I would be surprised if there's researchers not in Europe, maybe even Australia, but primarily the United States, where funding typically can be higher if they're already not looking at the potential effects on brain health. So I would like it to go more from a medical standpoint, but those are the 3 areas I see it going into. I think we're pretty confident on potential cellular side effects, and there aren't any, but we still need to look at more long-term effects. And the other big one is, and I've talked to Mike Roberts from Auburn about this, I still think creatine can have a direct effect on protein synthesis. I just don't think we've had the sample size. Just because it turns on everything else. And in rodents and some of the rodent cells, it has shown to increase mTOR and satellite cells. I just think a longer-term study. So I'd like to do a long-term cellular study to see the effects it potentially can increase mTOR or something else. So those are the 4 areas. But you're right, I probably got 30 more studies to go. Another 30 years of research to do this.
I bet if you looked at area under the curve of MPS over time, you'd see something, even if it wasn't an acute blip in the same way.
And it's just so expensive to do these studies. And you know, when it comes to sports nutrition, the government typically won't fund studies. We were fortunate to get funding from the CIHR, the Canadian government, to do some clinical studies. But very rare would anybody ever fund a study to do it in young, healthy people. Because why? They don't cost the healthcare system anything. Right. So to get all this research, we're more looking at cancer and metabolic diseases. But the next application will be in type 2 diabetes in adults 50 years and above. It's a massive global epidemic. It's going to cost the healthcare system $1 trillion in the next decade. So that's sort of where it's leaning. But these studies just cost, some cost millions of dollars to do. And sometimes the results don't work out for whatever reason. So it's a chicken or the egg, right? You just keep fighting and trying to strive for it. But those are the areas I think need to be looked at. And then maybe a protein caloric deficit one is something that's of interest, because what's better to take if you had to ask people, protein or creatine? Hopefully people say both, but is one better? We don't really know, right? It'd be a good debate at a conference, because you could come up and synthesize that in a something like that. So
yeah, that would be really interesting for me to see is have one group on a quote unquote optimal protein dose, one group on a suboptimal protein dose for muscle retention, and then also have the placebo controlled creatine intake. And that would be cool to see whether creatine's main driving factor is NPB or some of the signaling cascades might lead to MPS. That'd be very cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Omar, I think we learned a lot of things. We had one of the most prolific distributors of creatine in Canada, and we have the kingpin of it all, who is we learned where he is at in the supply chain.
Yes,
he's not a middleman, because he was totally comfortable saying, "Hey, these supplement companies, they're going to mark it up, get it as cheap as you can," because he's straight at the manufacturing level. He's at the top of the food chain. Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So white powder.
don't cross this man, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, you think the jacket's just for flair, but it's a statement of intent that says, "Hey, you know what? Just try and test me, okay?"
My entourage is outside, so we'll go there.
Well, for those that can.
And they are looking juicy. They're on the creatine. Yeah.
They are looking like they have saturated levels of creatine.
That's right.
Right. Now, I guess what I would want to close out with, Darren, would be to give you the floor, give you the opportunity to circle back to any conversation or subject that we touched upon, or anything you feel that we may have missed out to the listeners, or just in general as it relates to creatine.
I think we touched on a lot of things, but in summary, if I was to talk to anybody off the street and they asked about it, I say exercise is your first priority. If you want to substantially increase the benefits of exercise, the two main things proven from science to focus on are dietary protein and creatine supplementation. If you add those two, you can expect some slightly greater benefits. But if you want to improve muscle mass, potentially bone mass, and muscle performance, creatine has been shown numerous times through meta-analysis to be effective. You can get creatine naturally through red meat or seafood, but all the studies have looked at supplementation. It's relatively cheap, but you got to be educated as a consumer to make sure you're getting pure creatine monohydrate. Those are the main things that has a take-home message. Most people do not suffer any adverse effects, but please make sure you're educated and you rely on science before you go out and take anything into the body. That includes anything from any type of supplement. But overall, creatine, in my biased opinion, I'm trying to be a salesman here, it seems to be one of the most effective overall dietary supplements that the human body can ingest. Right behind it would probably be caffeine, and then protein, just because it doesn't have as much magnitude of effect from a performance standpoint. But creatine seems to be at the top of the hill right now. And more research will just keep laying the foundation for increasing the education and knowledge about what it is, dispelling all the myths. So again, to your consumer or viewers, make sure you rely on science and keep listening to your guys' podcast, right? That's the key.
Well, thank you for that, and for plugging the Iron Culture podcast.
Absolutely.
And lastly, if people want to find out more about your research or what you do, where can they find you?
They can either just follow me on Instagram, or if you Google me on PubMed or whichever, easy to find. I'm more than happy to answer any emails, send you lots of boring articles. You'd have to read them all, but again, rely on science. Don't rely on the myths and the bro science out there per se, because you might be getting false information. But just simply follow me on Instagram. I usually post a whole bunch of boring things there. Twitter, Facebook, or email me. It's easy to find if you just Google my name or go to PubMed and look at some articles. If you don't have access to it, open access, they're super expensive. We have them. I can just simply email them. I'm more than happy, and I'll obviously answer any questions with it for sure.
Can I just say that I think it's fantastic that we're united under this iron culture, that someone like yourself, who is so prolific with their research, if someone really did want to ask a question, they would be able to send you a DM on Instagram and get a response. Where there's other,
100%.
other communities where maybe I don't know if it's the size, I don't know if the cult is just still small enough, but that availability of some of either top researchers or educators, such as I know Eric, you try your best to respond to DMs. You actually take too much time, in my opinion, responding to comments. I'm joking on Instagram. Helping people out. I just think it's fantastic. And I think that whole process of trying to educate other individuals, and as you said, Eric, extend the ladder down to bring other people up, but not everyone. You want to still, some people, it is a zombie
Keep them
apocalypse.
below.
A selective ladder. Yeah.
Right. It's a self, the sorting hat in Harry Potter. It's a self-selecting ladder. It's a little slippery. Only the strong
Some
will
of the
survive.
rungs just break for certain people. Yeah.
Yeah. But I just want to say, Darren, thank you for being on our podcast. We'll have the link to
My
everything.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Just mentioned in the description. I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of Iron Culture, where we just got informed. Go ahead, get yourself addicted, because it really is an addiction to creatine. If you enjoyed the episode, go ahead and leave a rating review on iTunes. It does help us out. On YouTube, we'll do our best to respond to the comments, and we'll see everyone on that next episode on Monday.